Poetics is one of the few surviving works of Aristotle. It is a philosophical work on the theory and implementation of literature, specifically the tragedy, which in ancient Greece was told through a play on stage. Aristotle, through Poetics, lays out the types of literature of his time and explains what makes a proper tragedy. This work is a great introduction to how humans approach art and the pieces one needs to build that art. Aristotle was a Greek philosopher who lived in the 4th century BC. He was a student of Plato and then became a tutor to Alexander the Great. Even though most of his works haven't survived over time, Poetics has gone on to influence both art and literature in the Western world. So without further ado, this is Aristotle's Poetics. To understand the more specific pieces of Aristotle's literary theory, we must first examine the foundation of why and how art is created. According to Aristotle, imitation is this foundational aspect of art. He would agree with the phrase, art imitates life. Humans, to tell proper stories, have to imitate real life. While that doesn't mean that all art is based in reality, it does mean that most stories could be understood by humans and humans alone. Aristotle believed that the way humans imitate to create art was through action, specifically men in action. We imitate through literature by telling stories about men who are either better than us or worse than us from a moral standpoint. No doubt a victim of his time, Aristotle didn't believe stories could be told about women in action, or slaves in action for that matter. The best example of why we imitate and how imitation leads to art is that from a young age, we learn and receive pleasure through imitation. Thus, it would make sense that as we age, our interest in learning and pleasure is intensified. And art provides us that satisfaction outside of our daily lives. There are 3 ways that our imitations can differ. This is through manner, medium, and object. A narrative is an example of manner, just like types of poetry are an example of the medium, and a man is an example of an object of imitation. Aristotle believed that art was simply the imitation of reality, and he needed us to understand this to dive deeper into his literary theory. So the next component of Aristotle's literary theory flows through the types of literature that were around at the time. In ancient Greece, you could separate most of the Greek storytelling into drama, lyric poetry, and epic poetry. Epic poetry is essentially what the poet Homer dealt with. You know, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Written in verse while telling an epic story about an epic hero. Aristotle respected Homer and thought he knew how to brilliantly craft literature, but Aristotle tended to appreciate the tragedy more than anything. To further splice the category of drama, we can look at satire, comedy, and tragedy as the main ways smaller, less epic stories were told in ancient Greece. Satirical works were some of the oldest, and they were the first comedies, as these works typically dealt with real people and were personal attacks on those real people. Comedies had been around for some time, but there was no history written down about them because no one thought they were intelligent or important pieces of literature. Finally, we come to the tragedy, where Aristotle intentionally wanted us to focus most of our attention. So how did Aristotle define a tragedy? Well, he simply stated that a tragedy imitates an action. This action was simple, necessary, and fairly true to life. In many cases, the action would be driven by thought and character. The meat of Poetics is in the components of a tragedy and how a good one is created. To create a successful tragedy in Aristotle's eyes, you needed to have plot, character, thought, diction, song, and spectacle. See, the plot is what he considered the soul of a tragedy, the story of it all, and how it flows together to tell a great tale. Character is related to the main character or characters you use to tell your story. Some important attributes that a character, especially a tragic character, would have are to be good from a moral perspective, have propriety, which basically means manly valor, which is a roundabout way of saying that Aristotle specifically meant men of valor, and specifically claims that women cannot hold these roles. Interestingly, Aristotle touches on women and slaves in tragedies, and goes on to say that both women and slaves are too normal of creatures to have successful tragedies written around them. Other attributes of a tragic character are being true to life and consistent. Thought is simply described as what is possible. Diction, the expression of memory in words. Song, pretty self-explanatory, as they use songs in the tragic plays of Greece all the time. And finally, we have spectacle, which is mainly limited to the stage, which you could consider today this would be the job of the stage manager, and according to Aristotle, is considered to be the least artistic part of a tragedy, mainly because it has nothing to do with the actual poet. So now that we have covered the outer limits of a tragedy, Aristotle directs us to a deep dive in the plot of the tragedy, which is the most important and artistic piece of a tragedy to him. The plot structure is not only the basis for a great tragedy, but vital to its creation. Every plot needs a beginning, a middle, and an end. That seems pretty clear to us, but during Aristotle's time, it wasn't as clear. So what are some of the characteristics of a great plot? Well, Aristotle says that the longer the plot, the better, but to avoid being too long as it becomes an epic poem like Homer's. Epic poems and tragedies are distinct pieces of work. They require different components to be created. Aristotle continues by advising that a plot doesn't include all events related to one person or topic, but only those necessary to tell the story of one single action. This is a mantra that Aristotle throws at the readers many times throughout Poetics, as he wants it to be abundantly clear to us that tragedies are about one action that creates all other dialogue and scenes in the tragedy. A great way to understand exactly what he means is by looking at the difference between historians and poets. Historians, like Herodotus, take a single time period. It could be 1 year or 1,000 years, and they tell you about every single event that happened during that time period. Poets, on the other hand, take a much smaller amount of time, and according to Aristotle, should not take place in excess of one revolution of the sun. And poets tell you what may have happened, not what actually happened. Aristotle says in the book, historians express the particular and poets express the universal. So circling back to our pieces, to a great plot that Aristotle tells us that the best plots tell stories. These stories inspire pity or fear through cause and effect in tandem with surprise. He also notes that creative coincidences can be powerful in tragedies. Now that we've gotten a feel for some of the basics of the plot, let's take a look at some of the specific types of plots Aristotle says are out there. He claims there are 4 types of plots you can create. simple, complex, pathetic, and ethical. He then says that each one is more like a piece of the puzzle, so the more of these types of plots you can add into one plot, the better. But be careful not to confuse your audience. So the simple plot is, well, simple. Its characteristics are that it has none of the characteristics of the other types we will talk about. A complex plot deals with three main instigations: reversal of situation, recognition, and a scene of suffering. These are the powerful tools that can create a powerful complex plot. Reversal of situation is simply an action that causes the opposite to happen. Like, for example, you steal money to give to the poor, but that in turn causes someone to steal from you, and you lose everything you have. Recognition deals with characters having stunning realizations that change how they act towards each other in a tragedy. Finally is the scene of suffering. This is used to twist the audience around and can include, but is not limited to, death, bodily agony, and wounds. And now that I think about it, these wounds can be superficial in nature. So rounding out the types of plots according to Aristotle are the pathetic plot and the ethical plot. Pathetic is where passion is the main motive, and ethical is where the motives are driven by the ethics of a character. Since we now know what we need to include in our plots, let's briefly go over the 30,000-foot view of a plot structure. Aristotle lays these out in order as prologue, episode, exode, and chronic song. These are what he calls the quantitative plot. So, we've covered the imitation of literary theory and the actual types of literature, specifically the tragedy, because that is what Aristotle focuses on. The last in Aristotle's triad of literary theory has to do with the poet. As we were all told in school, the process of writing starts with an outline. Then you nail down the scenes, and then expand into greater detail about those scenes. No doubt this came from Aristotle. Next on the poet's checklist is to make sure that he or she is imitating three objects. One is things as they were or as they are. Two is things as they are said or thought to be said. And three, things as they ought to be. As long as you're imitating one or multiple of these things, Aristotle thinks you're on the right track. These are the core mechanics that specifically affect the poet when attempting to create a great piece of work. If you have these imitations, then you have a solid foundation of a story to work with. A quick and simple piece of advice that Aristotle gives us in the book is to simply be appropriate. For example, an angry character rages and an agitated character storms off. Poets tend to hyper-focus on unnecessary pieces of their work, and this can cause them to miss things. Specifically, when using a stage for a tragic play, the poet needs to have a wide-angle view of the creation. Speaking of the poet's focus, it needs to simply tell the action of one story. Homer didn't tell the story of the whole war of Troy, just the one story he needed to tell. I call this next bit of information a poet's trick. Aristotle tells us that a poet can and should lie. He gives the example that probable impossibilities are greater than improbable possibilities. Also, he claims that tragic plots should be rational. Anything irrational should be outside of the action of the play. So finally, Aristotle lays out some of the typical objections that a critic or a censor would have towards literature. These objections could be because the work is impossible, morally hurtful, irrational, contradictory, or contrary to artistic correctness. Aristotle refutes most of these objections in his writing. Art is too complex to be simply objected to because the art can always explain away most of these. Aristotle simply encourages the reader to employ the techniques he has provided and, most of all, imitate. And I want to leave you all with this quote from the book by Aristotle. Those who employ spectacular means to create a sense, not of the terrible, but only of the monstrous, are strangers to the purpose of tragedy. For we must not demand of tragedy any and every kind of pleasure, but only that which is proper to it.